why on earth was he ever made a trade envoy? I mean, he comes across as a complete idiot. I mean, maybe there's hidden depths that I don't know about, but I wouldn't trust him with my telephone number, never mind state secrets.
For many years now, we've known that the issue of Islamist terrorism is an enormous one. Last time anyone checked the figures, there was about 39,000 Islamists on MI5's terrorism watch list. That's 2 Manchester arenas almost of people.
It's like any attempt at accountability, whether that's to the press or to the electorate. It's just a major inconvenience, and we should all just get in our boxes and shut up.
Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers. Delighted to be joined as ever in the studio by Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And thrilled to have returning Spike columnist, Joanna Williams.
Hello.
We've got plenty to discuss today. We'll be talking about the arrest of Prince Andrew, the plot to kill Manchester's Jews, and Keir Starmer's war on democracy. The British government's war on free speech is continuing at pace. The Online Safety Act is already blocking vast amounts of perfectly legal content, but Keir Starmer has pledged to tighten the rules even further on what you can see online. If you're watching this from Europe or Australia, it's exactly the same story. But what if I told you there's an easy, simple way to beat the censors? The good news is, thanks to our partners, Private Internet Access, or PIA for short, you can access tons of content that the powers of be don't want you to. PIA is the VPN I use and trust whenever I'm accessing the internet. A VPN, or virtual private network, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. Instead of giving away your personal information and location to the world, PIA lets you change your IP address to one of 91 countries. This means you can gain access to websites and services that are only available in those locations. And it's not just that. Did you know that streaming services like Netflix and Prime Video have huge catalogues of content, but you can only access a fraction of it from your own country? Using PIA to change your location opens up a whole new world of streaming. Paying for Netflix without using PIA is a bit like paying for front row seats at the cinema, but being forced to sit in the hallway. PIA is also essential for keeping yourself safe online. It protects you from the prying eyes of hackers, internet service providers, and anyone else with an unhealthy interest in your personal information or online activity. Personally, I would never go online again without it. And because PIA is available for all platforms, I never need to worry about my safety or privacy. It works on Windows, Apple Macs, iPhones, Androids, and more. Even better, you only need one subscription to protect yourself across all the devices you own. So, sign up now to the world's most transparent VPN provider and take advantage of our special offer. Spiked viewers and listeners can get 86% off a subscription to Private Internet Access. That's just £1.67 a month. And you'll also get an extra 4 months thrown in, completely for free. To take advantage of this incredible deal, just go to piavpn.com/spiked. That's piavpn.com/spiked. Signing up is totally risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. You won't regret it. Sign up now at piavpn.com/spiked. The man formerly known as Prince Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, was arrested on the day that we're recording this. This is really the mother of all scandals. He had already had his titles removed from him last year, and now he is being questioned by police on suspicion of essentially misconduct in public office. We don't know the exact details of what the police are investigating, what leads they're following, but he has previously been alleged on the basis of the Epstein files to have shared confidential information with contacts while he was a trade envoy in the 2010s. Tom, what have you made of this?
Well, it's a seismic moment for the royal family. It's obviously a seismic moment in the Epstein files, the second time in a matter of weeks that a hugely significant figure in British public life has found themselves investigated, interviewed under police caution, and having their properties raided as a consequence of alleged wrongdoing. So, you know, it's kind of very difficult to find the words to describe what a big moment this is. I mean, it's I suppose it's also important to work out what it isn't, because I think that the nature of the Epstein scandal is that a lot of things get conflated all at the same time. So it's worth saying that this relates to, as you were talking about, their misconduct in public office, whereas if you went on social media at the moment, you would think people were taking this as straightforward proof that he was involved in the most depraved and nefarious things that certain sections of the internet believe that Andrew has always been guilty of, even though he's always denied any wrongdoing where sexual assault or misconduct is concerned. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about why have Britain taken these allegations so seriously, where in America nothing has ever happened. It's because these are kind of quite straightforwardly in relation to the kind of more financial and public office questions, rather than the more lurid and depraved allegations that sit there. So I think it's really important that we separate out the parts, not just legally, because this is an ongoing case and there's not very much that we are allowed to say, but also because I think that sort of tendency to put everything in the same bucket is not great for, in fact, it's terrible for due process and for trying to sift out the truth from the conspiratorialism which exists around the Epstein issue.
Joe, what have you?
I mean, it's very hard to know what to make of this, really, because on the one hand, as Tom points out, this is something which is historically unprecedented. I mean, you have to go back hundreds of years, quite literally, to find a time when a member of the royal family was last arrested. So in that sense, this is an incredibly major and significant event. But on the other hand, it's like, you feel as if everybody's known this all along. And what's odd to me, anyway, is why Andrew was ever trusted with anything secret in the first place. I mean, why on earth was he ever made a trade envoy? I mean, he comes across as a complete idiot. I mean, maybe there's hidden depths that I don't know about, but I wouldn't trust him with my telephone number, never mind state secrets. And that's what strikes me as odd about all of this. But I mean, it's also quite bizarre, even given the historically unprecedented nature of this, to see the relish with which it's being talked up by the media and also by figures like Keir Starmer. And you can't help but think, when Starmer kind of mouths off about Andrew, he's kind of quite relieved that the attention is pointing away from him and the scandals that have been embroiling his government. But also there is something slightly jarring about all the attention that was given to this, as opposed to, say, the grooming gangs, you know, the girls who've been raped, women who've been murdered or attacked by asylum seekers. And it's like we found a rich white man, a privileged rich white man who we can get behind as a figure of hate. And actually, in the grand scheme of things, I think what he's being accused of seems to me fairly trivial and not at all surprising. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's worth remembering, you know, talking about why was Andrew ever hired for this trade envoy role, which may be the thing that gets him in trouble. I mean, his reputation, not as someone who did anything illegal, but as at the very kindest words, people would use the word playboy. Randy Andy, the tabloids used to call him. You know, there was I think a lot of people were warned that he will use these foreign trips for chasing girls and playing golf. So it seems as if it is discovered that Andrew did something wrong in this role, I think a lot of other people will have to ask why they hired him in the first place. Similar to Mandelson. Why was Mandelson put in such a position when it was obvious that he had these links to Jeffrey Epstein? And in fact, it's even worse, arguably, because in Mandelson's case, we knew that the Epstein files were about to come out and that things would be exposed that would make certain people uncomfortable. So again, you just wonder, how does the British state operate in this way? Why are people who seem singularly unqualified being given these really plum jobs?
No, and the parallels between the two of them is very, very striking. You kind of have a figure of the very much old establishment, as far as a member of the royal family, and a figure of the new kind of late 20th century, early 21st century establishment in the form of Mandelson, who might have been occasionally an MP, but was basically a kind of figure of the sort of unelected globalist political class, both being able to take up positions that fail upwards and have potentially wrongdoing kept from public eyes, or at least not facing the full consequences of it by dint of their position. But whilst without wanting to sound cynical or dismissive about what are quite serious charges, you know, passing on for financially sensitive information in Mandelson's case that could have been of direct financial use to Epstein, this is not something that anyone who holds any form of public office should be engaging in. kind of 'twas ever thus. The thing that's new about this scandal was the attempt to kind of fold it into this broader narrative, which is that, even putting aside Epstein, kind of anyone who was associated with him was part of this kind of transnational paedophile ring, the ease with which people essentially conflate or set aside the two scandals of the misconduct in public office versus this broader criminal enterprise, which is gestured to and very rarely defined. That's something that's a little bit newer, and is to me not great for politics, because I think it has a tendency to just be a conspiratorial lens with which to look at the elite rather than kind of reckon with them in a clear-eyed way. And also it kind of feeds a sense of cynicism. These people are not just idiots or in it for themselves or wrong-headed in all kinds of ways. They're sort of depraved and evil, which I think is a quite debilitating kind of conclusion to come to. And just quickly, I think this was quite unseemly. And I say this as a Republican myself, the way in which so many people on the Republican side of the argument are just kind of hoping that this very unseemly scandal will do what them and their terrible arguments about the cost of the Jubilee never managed to achieve. And that is something which is really not to be welcomed.
I second that, Tom. I mean, I'm opposed to the royal family and I'm opposed to Starmer's Labour government, but if this were the scandal that brought them down, that would be quite extraordinary.
I mean, I'm not a royalist either, but I do think there's something odd about 6 unmarked police cars turning up in a dawn raid. I mean, it's not like Andrew was going to go wandering off around the country and people didn't know where he was. And it's just like the whole thing's turned into a bit of a media spectacle, a bit of a circus, 24-hour rolling news coverage, drones flying above his house. And again, you just think we've had some much, much bigger, to my mind, scandals that have really should have got a lot more attention than they've deserved in the news over the past few weeks. And yet this is the story that people give 24-hour news coverage and drones and police cars to, etc., etc. And it just seems something a bit warped, not only about the priorities that put people like Mandelson and Andrew in those positions of power decades ago, but are kind of carrying on, elevating them in a certain way by giving them the attention of all this news coverage and police time and focus today.
Shall we talk about the horrifying plot that was foiled? 2 men have been sentenced for plotting to kill as many Jews as they could find, to borrow their own language. They pledged allegiance to ISIS. Lots of weapons were found, thousands of rounds of ammo, and their plan was to go to an anti-Semitism march in Manchester, gun people down indiscriminately, and then go to a Jewish part of Manchester to gun people outside of their schools and businesses and synagogues. Tom, I mean, this speaks to two of the twin evils of our time, really, but two evils that we feel that we are not able to talk about openly: anti-Semitism and Islamism.
And the way in which they become intertwined there, if this horrific plot had been successful, it would not only have been potentially one of the deadliest Islamist terror attacks this country would have ever witnessed. It would also have been the third terror attack since October the 7th, all three of which really in the UK have revolved around the issue of Gaza in one way or another, and the issue of anti-Semitism in one way or another. It was only a week after October the 7th that there was that attack in Hartlepool, where you had a Moroccan asylum seeker who became obsessed with watching October the 7th videos, stabbed his Iranian housemate. They were living in an HMO, and then went out into the street and killed a British man. So not targeting Jews per se, but inspired by horrific Jew hatred in the south of Israel. You then, of course, had Jihad al-Shami last year, who tried to stab his way into that synagogue near Heaton Park. And now we have another foiled plot in Manchester, would have preceded Jihad al-Shami's attack, we should say, but nevertheless, explicitly targeting Jews. If you look at what Walid Sadawi, who was the ringleader of this plot, was saying to the man who turned out to be working with the police, who ended up foiling this plot, he was saying that, we go for the Jews first. If we catch a few Christians, that'll be a bonus, but we're targeting the Jews. I mean, it's just so explicit, and it raises an awful lot of questions about how seriously we're taking this threat, Islamism in general and Islamist anti-Semitism in particular. It raises a lot of questions about how increasingly it seems like a lot of these plots are hatched by people who have come into this country as well. In this case, it was a Tunisian national and a Kuwaiti national, a porous borders part of the equation here, almost certainly. So, and also the fact that for many years now, we've known that the issue of Islamist terrorism is an enormous one. Last time anyone checked the figures, there was about 39,000 Islamists on MI5's terrorism watch list. That's 2 Manchester arenas almost of people. and yet nothing ever really seems to change. And something like this happens and everyone treats it as, oh, we dodged a bullet there. But, as we talked about this last time, as the old saying goes, they only have to be lucky once. And when there's 39,000 of them, that's an awful lot of chances to get lucky. So this is something which has come and gone without much comment, I think it's fair to say. Keir Starmer did a tweet about it, which was nice of him. Didn't actually mention the word Islamism, as is his wont. And that's the kind of thing that we're used to, I suppose, is treating these things as horrific accidents which were mercifully averted rather than something which is clearly a sustained terroristic medieval threat against British society and British Jews more pointedly in the last couple of years. And yet something that we just kind of, allowed the security services to quietly get on with rather than confront on a more meaningful level.
Joan?
Yeah, I agree with everything Tom said. I think really there are two terrible things here. I mean, the first one is the plot itself, the plan, the horrible plan that these men had cooked up to slaughter Jews. But then the second terrible thing is the cloak of silence really surrounding it. The fact that this came and went in the news, with people barely batting an eyelid about it. It barely warranted a headline. The discussion just moves on. I mean, something I try and do now whenever these news stories about anti-Semitism come up is to reverse it and think about how this would be reported if it was a crime against Muslims or a crime against an anti-Islamic or Islamophobic, supposedly, attack. And another news story that made the headlines again incredibly briefly this week was that in the 24 hours after the shooting in the Manchester synagogue, there was a real spike in anti-Semitic hate crime. Now, you just think if that had been a shooting that had been carried out in a mosque, and if in the 24 hours after a shooting in a mosque, there'd been a spike in Islamophobic hate crime, we would be talking about nothing else. That would have been the main news story. It would have been the stuff of panic. We would have been discussing it for weeks as a main news story. Instead, this kind of comes and goes. It's there in the morning, in the news headlines in the morning. Even by that afternoon, it's not being mentioned anymore. And I think that's the terrible two things that are going on here that seem to be working in conjunction. There's the nature of the anti-Semitic attacks themselves, but then also there's the veil of silence that we're drawing over these things.
And the term Islamophobia is wielded even when there is an Islamist attack. We're told that actually the real scourge is Islamophobia, and you shouldn't get too angry, you shouldn't get too heated in worrying about these kinds of events. We saw a particularly twisted example of this earlier this week from Hannah Spencer, the Green Party candidate in Gorton and Denton, who was arguing with Matt Goodwin, who is the Reform candidate. Hannah was arguing with Matt Goodwin. She was put on the spot as to why did she think the Manchester Arena attack happened, the one in 2017, the Ariana Grande concert.
What we did after the terror attacks was we came together and we stuck up for each other.
But you've never asked, why are those things happening?
Of course we have.
Why are they happening?
Of course we have, because people like you are dividing
so I'm responsible for the Manchester Evening News Arena bombing now?
That's not what I've just said.
Because we have very real issues with integration.
And she couldn't use the I word, Islamism, but even worse, she tried to blame it on those spreading hate and division, as if Islamist attacks were actually the fault of people who notice and are opposed to Islamist attacks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think Hannah Spencer is just the more idiotic version of what is increasingly quite a mainstream position, or at least deflection on the part of politicians and the great and good. Really reminded me of after the Heaton Park attack, where you had Gary Neville, doing a little piece to camera where he seemed to imply that part of the problem with the people putting up flags in Manchester, Operation Raise the Colours, was why a man called Jihad decided to try and stab some Jews. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. It's also kind of implicit in the attempt that you get from politicians to sort of generalise the terroristic threat, the entreaties for us all to stand up to all forms of extremism, to all come together against hate. Never are these things specifically defined, which is particularly perverse when you have a terror threat such as we have in this country, which is 94% of the people murdered by terrorists in Great Britain since 1999 were murdered by people motivated by Islamism. Reminds me of that Morrissey quote when people would talk vaguely about extremism. He said, an extremist what? An extremist rabbit. We all know what we're talking about, and yet people refuse to talk about it. in a sense, what Hannah Spencer was doing was behaving in the way that we'd been coached to behave in response to these things, which is to generalize, to avoid looking this problem in the face, to pretend as if there's just this kind of general vague cloud of hate and division which can manifest itself in an Islamist attack, rather than that being a specific ideology which comes from a specific tradition, and which has been fermented within this country, and to a certain extent imported into this country as well more so in recent years. It's really born of a refusal to acknowledge any of that, because it would mean looking at multiculturalism, it would mean looking at immigration, it would mean giving up a lot of the positions and orthodoxies that people have previously held and don't want to. And the fact that people are willing to essentially just stare into the middle distance and talk platitudes as more and more of their fellow citizens are murdered, I think there's nothing, I don't know there's much saving them if they're willing to engage in that kind of behaviour. The problem is is that it seems to infect large parts of the state and informs the kind of ineptitude and the lack of seriousness with which the Islamist threat is treated. If it was just Hannah Spencer saying these things, it wouldn't be so much of a problem, but obviously it has deeper impacts than that.
And the Green Party, of course, is deliberately kind of courting Islamic sectarianism. I'm not saying that they are pro-terrorism or anything like that, but they certainly, in this Gorton and Denton by-election, are, they've had the endorsement of the Muslim vote. It's as if there's almost additional pressure not to say anything that might be construed as Islamophobic, even though, of course, it's not Islamophobic or anti-Muslim to challenge these extremists and nutters.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think if people haven't seen the clip of Newsnight with this debate featuring the Green Party candidate and Matt Goodwin, I mean, it's really worth watching, because it's just an extreme example of the way Hannah almost seems to blame Matt Goodwin personally. It really is that crazy, as if it is him and his ilk that were responsible for this horrific terrorist attack. It's really quite shocking, but it brought home to me, I think, that whatever people might think of Reform as a political party, it's really, really important that the Green Party do not win in Manchester, because it's actually their party, I think, that is really responsible for giving a free pass to Islamism, and their party and their supporters, their kind of milieu that they are surrounding themselves in, that are really giving a free pass to anti-Semitism and to this sentiment that we must look the other way and not talk about the threat of Islamist terrorism. I think it's really important that they don't win. And we really, if you're in Manchester, need to go and big up Matt Goodwin so that the Green Party do not win, if for no other reason. And
it being in Manchester as well, so symbolic, obviously, because we are approaching the 10th anniversary next year of the Manchester Arena bombing, which is not only horrific on its own terms, 22 people murdered, many of them young girls at a pop concert and so on and so forth. But the more that we found out about how that attack was allowed to happen, the more it vindicated many of the points that we've made here. The fact that Salman Abedi's family, even though they were of explicitly Libyan Islamist stock, were allowed to be granted asylum in the UK in the 1990s, where they then had children, and Salman Abedi and his brother Hashem were born. They were allowed to claim asylum here precisely because they were Islamist opponents of Gaddafi. I mean, again, the level of naivety implicit there is incredible. The fact that the Abedis were able seemingly to travel back and forth from Manchester to Tripoli, which the Abedi brothers learnt how to build bombs, fought in the Libyan civil war, that nothing was done seemingly seriously enough to try and intercede them. MI5 having to apologise for missing opportunities to stop them. And then the kind of horrific cherry on the cake, which is that security guard who felt like he couldn't confront Abedi when he saw a young man sweating, looking very nervous, dressed all in black with a huge backpack on, because he was worried he would be accused of racism. So again, all of these things put together show you what allows something like that to happen. And the fact that that particular debate is happening in a by-election in Manchester, I think puts a bow on all of these terrible things that we've been talking about.
The Manchester Arena attack, the Heaton Park attack, and the foiled attack that we've just been talking about, all in Manchester. Absolutely terrifying. Let's talk about Keir Starmer and his abortive war on democracy. 30 local authorities were due to have their elections cancelled or postponed. He's now made a U-turn on that, so those elections will take place. Had these elections not gone ahead, then more than 4 million people would have been denied a vote in the local elections. He essentially only cancelled it because Reform UK mounted a legal challenge, and the government lawyers said, you're going to lose it in the High Court, so you better change course. Joe, what do you think this tells us about Starmer and his attitude to democracy? You know, the way that they could so casually think that elections don't really matter, that they're, you know, perhaps too expensive or inconvenient to hold.
No, well, I think that is it, isn't it? I mean, I think democracy is just a big inconvenience to Starmer. To have to consider the views of the electorate just gets in the way of him being able to put into whatever policy it is that seems to be flavour of the month for him that particular day. I think what's shocking is shocking that these elections were cancelled in the first place, as you pointed out, some for the second year in a row. And then it was only U-turned when a very serious threat that it would be overturned in court. So he didn't want that to happen. And so basically rode back on the decision before it became legally unviable for him to carry on with it. But there was no attempt to apologise or to acknowledge the kind of threat to democracy that had been there. It was almost as if, well, we had this bureaucratic problem and now we've got this legal issue, and democracy just doesn't feature anywhere in the discussion of that. But I think it's just symptomatic. I think the piece that you wrote on Spike this week, Fraser, puts it really nicely. Just symptomatic of Starmer's whole attitude towards democracy. Everywhere you look, from free speech to, I mean, the other big scandal that's been in the news this week is about the think tank Labour Together having carried out this investigation into a Sunday Times journalists who were doing the job as investigative journalists, doing exactly what they should be doing, and looking into donations that had gone to fund this Labour Party think tank, a think tank which has been very influential in getting Starmer elected and in filling many of the cabinet posts. And yet again, that's this attempt to just there's no, it's as if these journalists are just an inconvenience, just a nuisance, need to shut up. Nobody is quite going to apologise for what went on here. Nobody seems to think it's much of a big deal. It's like any attempt at accountability, whether that's to the press or to the electorate, is just a major inconvenience, and we should all just get in our boxes and shut up.
And of course, the other factor is that Labour is doing very, very badly in the polls, was guaranteed to lose a lot of these elections. Polling suggests at least half of the seats in May will be lost. What have you made of that? I mean, it seems as if he's running scared from the voters, of course, but also running scared from Reform UK in particular.
No, definitely, and it's very convenient, obviously. Because that's the other thing about Keir Starmer, is that on the one hand, a lot of the very authoritarian things he's done seem to spring from a certain sort of technocratic mindset, which is that you can junk very hard-won liberties and rights in pursuit of just sheer efficiency, even if that efficiency never materialises. So you get rid of jury trials because it would speed up, allegedly, bringing down the case backlog in the courts, or you can suspend local elections because they're going through this reorganisation. It's going to be too expensive, it's going to be too complicated, they won't sit for the full term, therefore just get rid of it, people won't care. You can bring in digital ID, as he was trying to do, because it will help us smash the gangs for some unclear reason, even though this is not a papers, please society, and people want to quite visceral level react against these kinds of things. But also in many of those cases, and particularly this one, it's just very convenient, isn't it? They knew they were in for a drubbing. They knew that politically they are losing support in several different directions. I mean, it seems like Reform are going to be the primary beneficiaries of these elections actually going ahead in these 30 localities. But, they're losing a bit more of their vote than that to the Green Party. They're also still losing votes to the Lib Dems. It looks like they've lost half of their kind of vote share, hence being primed to lose half of their seats in a lot of these places, according to the mega polls that have been done in this area. So it's always funny. You can understand where they come to these perspectives, because there isn't really a lot of principle and fealty to airy notions, as they might see it, of democracy or rights. But also it's always just very convenient for them to go down this route, because it's particularly for a government that is just flailing all over the place. Dodging another opportunity for accountability is obviously going to appeal to them.
I think what's worth noting is what an easy ride the Labour Party get in the press over all of these things.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine if it had been the Conservative government that had cancelled elections, tried to overturn jury trials, gone after journalists just for doing their job. I mean, there would have been uproar again. There would have been uproar about it. It would have been something that we'd been hearing about for weeks. Instead, we had weeks of, did Boris Johnson eat a slice of butter birthday cake or not. That was news for weeks. And instead we've got all of these major things happening, which really should shock us. Cancelling elections is not something to be done lightly. This is a real infringement upon our rights in this country, our democratic processes. And again, it's just another one of those things that barely warrants a headline.
And the scary thing is, I suppose it should shock us, but it shouldn't surprise us given Keir Starmer's past. I mean, this is the man who led the campaign to overturn the Brexit referendum, to cancel the democratic aspirations of 17.4 million people. And, if you go back further to his time as Director of Public Prosecutions, he was absolutely at the forefront of the kind of what we're now, I'm afraid, all too used to, of people being arrested and prosecuted for social media posts. He was absolutely insistent, actually against the advice of a lot of other lawyers within the Crown Prosecution Service, that Paul Chambers should be prosecuted for telling a joke on Twitter. He made this joke about wanting to blow up his local airport and became, a huge Twitter joke trial. Starmer was really, really adamant that this man must be punished. You look at him going after journalists as Director of Public Prosecutions. A lot of people have forgotten that in the wake of the phone hacking scandal, there were lots of other investigations into various alleged crimes that actually came to nothing. Starmer tried to prosecute 30 journalists, most of them from The Sun, and all of them have now since been cleared. So to me, that sounds like there is and always has been an authoritarian bent in Starmer. Luckily for us, he is kind of a useless prime minister, and so some of his worst plans, like digital ID, has thankfully been watered down. He's not got away with cancelling the elections.
The ineptitude is the only thing that saves you from the authoritarianism.
Exactly.
I think they reckon this is his 14th U-turn, and he made it having said that there were going to be no more U-turns about 3 hours previously on the radio. So that's our prime minister.
More U-turns, please, Keir.
Exactly. That's the best bit. That's the best bit, I think.
So thank you, Tom. Thank you, Joe. Thank you to everyone at home for watching. But that's not all. Join us in Spiked Podcast Unlocked, where we will be discussing Restore Britain and Rupert Lowe and much, much more. Of course, that is exclusive for Spike supporters. So if you're not a Spike supporter, sign up now by going to spiked-online.com/support, and you can watch the rest of the show. If you are a supporter, you should be able to find it on the website, on the homepage, and you can just log in and watch the rest of the show. Thank you so much for watching the Spike podcast, and thanks to our friends at Private Internet Access for sponsoring us. Now is the time to take control of your digital life and get PIA for 86% off. Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code. And remember, if you're a Spike supporter, then this episode isn't over yet. You can now watch the Spike podcast Unlocked. Just go to the Spike website, log in, and you'll see it on the homepage. So join us there right now. See you in a second.